The US Supreme Court has taken action against affirmative action in higher education. Affirmative action has been an American policy since the 1960s in which employers or universities give special preference to people from marginalized backgrounds. It was introduced as a means to counter underrepresentation in certain positions from people of a race, gender, nationality, or sexuality that are often discriminated against. However, in 2 cases against Harvard and North Carolina universities, the Supreme Court decided that it is unconstitutional to allow institutions to positively discriminate based on race. Chief Justice John Roberts said that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, and that the students must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. But many are angered by the Supreme Court's decision, claiming that the number of black students will drop due to conscious and subconscious bias. But is positive discrimination the same as discrimination? What will the future of black students look like following the Supreme Court's ruling? With this, the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the blocking of Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, is the Supreme Court becoming too political, or can it ever be apolitical? Should affirmative action be allowed in the US?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Should affirmative action be allowed in the U.S.? As always, we'll begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to allow your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Dr. Dibinga, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Well, first of all, the fact of the matter is that America has always had affirmative action, and it's had affirmative action for white people. When white people that came to America, going back to westward expansion, they were granted plots of land. When you look at other forms throughout its history, there have always been provisions made to help white people get ahead of in this society. Furthermore, white women have benefited from affirmative action more than any other group in our society. And lastly, there still is affirmative action for white people at Harvard University through legacy admissions, where the people who are admitted don't have to be qualified. They have to be children of people who are influential. So it's like comparing Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to a Jared Kushner, for example. And so those policies still exist. Both my parents got doctorates from Harvard. Yeah. When I applied, I didn't get in. We didn't have the complexion of connection.
Joe Bob, your thoughts?
I'll keep this brief for the opening part. Racism is racism, regardless of whether or not you think it's proactive or regressive. The United States as a whole says, hey, you can't be racist, and the Supreme Court upheld that decision. Now, I can probably agree, and we'll probably get into this on the whole legacy admission stuff. I think that's also wrong. But the whole idea that you're going to discriminate against certain races in order to give preferential treatment to other races shouldn't be allowed in the United States, regardless of what race you are.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your take.
It's a question of the ideal world versus the real world. Of course, colorblindness and individualism are excellent principles, but reality requires a bit more nuance. Affirmative action is based on the idea that past achievement does not always reflect potential because and true merit, because certain marginalized groups haven't had the chance, and therefore they need a leg up or a second look. How to do it and how much to do it is, of course, the big question. So as with most things in life, a balance is required.
Yes, the veil of ignorance taking center stage once again. And gentlemen, let's feel free to interact from this point onwards. And before we get to the basic notion of whether it is just or not, Dr. Dibinga, has affirmative action failed?
Well, it depends on what people are looking at as failure. And one of the challenges when people look at affirmative action is that they always associate it with black students only, or black people if you're talking about the corporate world. They only look at it that way. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that people always attach affirmative action to unqualified black students. And as Mr. Perry was saying just a moment ago, he talked about giving people a second look. In many situations, it's giving students a first look. People who normally would not, like a Clarence Thomas, who normally, because of where they were attending school or the community that they were in, were not going to be able to make it through the application process at Harvard because they didn't have the resources and the knowledge base. And so when you look at people like a Joy Ann Reid, a very popular news host in the United States, she talks about how people from Harvard came to her school and interviewed her. She already had the grades. She was already a stellar student to see if she would be a good fit for the campus. So to do things like that, I don't believe that that's a failure. And even when you look at this case with Harvard, the last 2 points I will make, many Asian students didn't have a problem with the policy. And then lastly, when you go to UNC, you're going to see a decline in black students, but you're not going to see a change in the taxpayer base because that's a public school. Black people and white people paying the same tax rate, but the admissions are going to be better for white people. Admissions to college is not just about test scores. It's about the well-rounded student.
But it's,
many of these students have the test scores as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Joe, Bob, please. Yeah.
There's a lot of components to getting into college, and race is the only thing they took out of the equation. Clarence Thomas, in his writings on this, said that you can still say that I grew up in a difficult situation. I had a family that didn't have any resources, or whatever you want to say, and that can all be taken into consideration. Why race has anything to do with those particulars is beyond me. There are rich black people in this country. There are poor black people. There are rich Asians. There are poor Asians. There are rich white people, there are poor white people. So to say that the color of your skin is solely determinative of how you can achieve in this culture is not accurate.
Look, I can help you out here because there's a reason why people think that. There is an enormous income gap in the U.S. and an even greater and completely inadmissible wealth gap. And it's understandable if you're talking about immigrants who came from poor and underdeveloped countries. But 10 generations down the road, if this is persistently the case, and if it diminishes not with great speed, then clearly there has been a failure. Ellie, it's not affirmative action that's failed. It's American society that has failed. And clearly there is an education failure. Clearly there is not enough being done in terms of frameworks and incentives. And therefore, a corrective action is needed. This is a matter of semantics,
really. But can you fix an injustice with an injustice? That's the basic question.
Well, the idea is that it isn't necessarily an injustice, because if you are making a special effort to identify the future potential of people who have not had the chance to show past achievement because they come from inner city schools which do not provide the same education as fine private schools, then obviously you're just attempting in some way to level the playing field. I do admit that it can feel terrible to people who were once dominant and now are the beheaded aristocrat. But there is an argument that the societal good is to increase the amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and that's John Stuart Mill. It's not me speaking.
One is you're assuming that the affirmative action has worked in terms of the average income of varying minorities. Anybody who's received affirmative action doesn't seem to actually have helped, because a lot of times they're comparing it to the white counterparts and not the top. Well, guess what? The top has changed, and Asian Americans and Indian Americans are at the top of the earning standards. So it doesn't really make sense that you would work on that sense. Now, I can agree with you. There are some educational problems that exist in the country. There's educational problems, but they exist a lot in urban areas, which you're correct. A lot of those areas are black. But the left in the United States has consistently and continually been against school choice and getting kids out of failing government schools, which probably would help more minorities get into colleges on merit.
Let's be realistic. Let's be realistic. As somebody who speaks in schools, as somebody who speaks in schools across the country, public, private, and charter schools, the fact of the matter is that there's a real not equal distribution of resources. We put ourselves in situations where, if you want to talk about our schooling systems and our urban education system, the policies that are in place to fund our school systems based on our taxpayer, based on our income. We fund our schools based on income. So if I'm in a poor neighborhood in D.C. and then I drive up the street to a richer neighborhood in Washington, D.C., none of the students in any of those schools did anything to deserve the facilities that they have. But if one group of parents makes $2 million a year and the other groups of parents makes $20,000 a year, the people who make $20,000 a year deserve to have a poorer school, and that sets up what Ketanji Brown Jackson called an intergenerational transmission of inequality. And so we have to be mindful of that. And when you couple this with the decision on student loans, you're making a further, and remember, Ronald Reagan wanted to have more of this college tuition increase because he wanted to have fewer undesirables at these universities. So that double whammy is pushing people further out of having an opportunity to get into this. And when I talk in my book, Lies About Black People, I'm talking specifically about how we've attached affirmative action to the face of Black underachievement when it has been nothing of the sort. People like Clarence Thomas, who was a high achiever, who was very qualified, he is the face of affirmative action. And many Black people and other groups who have benefited from that, they may not be at the top of the income scale, but they are definitely better off than where they would be without these policies.
And by the way, Joe Bob, there are various studies that show how affirmative action has had results. One of them is the graduation gap that shows that, for example, states in areas and in schools that have affirmative action, it has fallen from 10% to 5 to 6%. I'm not sure why that would be funny. And also, by the way, the income and wealth inequalities, which I bemoaned earlier on, are diminishing. Just not fast enough. You could argue that affirmative action has had something to do with that by creating more polished people from minority backgrounds that are ready for the workplace, and obviously that attaches to income. Realistically, there is not a problem in America of overall of white people having no access to wealth. White people control I think $124 trillion worth of wealth in the U.S. compared to less than $10 trillion for Black people, and that's about 4 to 1 on a per capita basis. Yeah. It's just not the problem. The problem is angry, seething masses of minority people who have reason to be unhappy, and I fail to see why we would celebrate the removal of one of the methods that we have tried to ease the problem.
Their skin, yeah, there's a right to celebrate that.
Please, Joe Bob. Yeah, continue.
Well, first things first, if you're going to go with arbitrary statistics as graduation rates, when you lower the bar for a bunch of different areas across schooling, across the state of California specifically is a great example of D's get degrees nowadays. It's a difficult thing to look at there. But when you're talking about eliminating the ability for people to judge someone based entirely on the color of their skin, that's the whole point of the country. We don't want to have people entirely judged on their skin color. Let's go with merit, and maybe this makes me a bad person. I believe that minorities can succeed in a meritocracy. Oh my gosh.
Jared Kushner did not get into Harvard on merit. You're talking about kids who are going to school with their parents' name on the building. So if you're gonna so if you agree with me, stop going to the merit argument, because 70% of legacy of white students at Harvard are legacy admissions. They may not be qualified. But their parents
guys, it isn't exactly true, by the way. The Harvard study showed that there is a preference for legacy people, and we know that. Nobody thinks they got in having no merit purely because of legacy.
It's getting heated right before we need to take a break. A few minutes, and we'll be back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dan Perry, Joe Bob, Dr. Mikongo Dibinga. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic. But before we get back to our conversation, this is obviously all part of the greater culture wars, if you will. So let's take a quick listen to former and hopeful U.S. President Donald Trump, what he had to say on that.
What they did yesterday. If you've worked hard, gotten fantastic marks, done well in all of the other various things that you have to do well on, somebody that hasn't done nearly as well, who perhaps has not worked as hard, will not be taking your place on a school, college, or university roster any longer. To vigorously enforce yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, I will eliminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the entire federal government.
Okay, another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, gentlemen. Scrapping diversity and inclusion programs. More problems or less problems? Joe Bob, take the lead, please.
Well, if scrapping diversity, equity, and inclusion is solely focused on race, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I like diversity, but I'd rather have it in thought, in perspective, in occupation, in so many different things other than skin color. I don't quite understand why that plays such a big role in American society. I think the whole purpose of this country is to eliminate that sort of thing. So I'm pro-diversity, but anti if it's only just your skin color.
Dan Perry?
Eliminating these programs certainly risks exacerbating one of the main problems in the U.S., which is, as I say, the large income and wealth gap that causes minorities to be restless. And so, look, I don't think these programs were meant to be forever solutions. They're rather a pathway to a better future where there is true equal opportunity, which would require maybe a different kind of affirmative action, like a massive Marshall Plan for improving education in disadvantaged neighborhoods.
Last but not least, Dr. Omikongo Dibinga, your thoughts?
Well, if Joe Bob's saying he's in favor of diversity but doesn't want to include race, then he's not in favor of diversity. I mean, as Julian Bond said, if you look, you twist the words of America around, it literally spells out "I am race." I worked under Trump's policy, and when he was a president, when I was going to corporations and different things, they were saying, "Don't say this about race. Don't say this about religion. Don't say this about gender." Diversity is not just race; it's gender, and like Joe Bob said, it's diversity of thought, sexual orientation, it's age, physical ability. And if you can't speak about those things, you can't have honest discussions in these companies, and I've seen it firsthand.
Gentlemen, let's feel free to engage in a conversation from this point onwards. Let's circle back to the issue of the Supreme Court itself. Is it becoming too political? Can it ever become apolitical, or return to be, or become, you be the judge of that, apolitical, Joe Bob?
Yeah, I don't really see much in the way of problems with the Supreme Court. Just because it leans right for the first time in a ton of decades doesn't mean that it's a far extreme court. Just a quick statistic to throw out there that I think a lot of people don't know. Only 5% of cases in the Supreme Court in this cycle were a 6-3 decision. In other words, on ideological lines. So the overwhelming majority of the Supreme Court decisions are pretty in agreement with everybody. So the whole idea that the Supreme Court is just off the rails is kind of comical, especially when you look at the entirety of the scope of what they've looked at this term.
Joe, Bob, it would be equally comical not to understand that the majority of cases before the Supreme Court are not by their nature political. So what we should look at is what happens when clearly political cases end up before the Supreme Court. I doubt it's 5% of the cases, probably more like 95% of the cases. And look, to your question, Ellie, it's inevitable when the system of choosing Supreme Court justices is so politicized that they're chosen purely on a basis of their politics, and they're only human beings. They know they have to satisfy the people who appointed them. Indeed, they want to. That's why they're so political to begin with. The system is genuinely broken. If what you want is a Supreme Court that is a bunch of sages, sitting around thinking sagacious thoughts, what we have is a bunch of politicians, and it goes way back to the 5-4 vote that selected George Bush in 2000 when he failed to be elected.
And I would add to that.
Dr.
The election discrepancies in that situation have been proven over and over and over.
Gentlemen, we want to hear all of you. It's difficult at the same time. Dr. Dibinga, please.
So the Supreme Court historically has only overturned about 1% of its decisions that it has made itself. 2 of those happened within the last week. This is a very activist-minded court, and if you're not going to start introducing things like term limits and the like, so people, judges don't hold on until their party person gets into power to elect another Republican or Democrat, it's always going to be politicized, just like with the cases of how we have district attorneys in this country. But we also have to add the level of corruption in terms of the lack of ethics that they have as a Supreme Court that other judges in the United States have to follow. When you look at, Clarence Thomas, Alito, and some of the thing that they've been involved in financially with some of these mega donors, even Sonia Sotomayor recused herself from a case with an author. These are real issues that need real reform in the Supreme Court. So yes, it's definitely political.
And you see the result in the plummeting popularity of the court, and the politicized nature of those who like them versus dislike them.
In the court is because they're doing things that the media doesn't like, and therefore the media is hitting for it. As far as the quote-unquote
the media conspiracy
stuff, nobody's quite sure if they have to report any of the stuff that they're being accused of. And also, you have to say that hasn't influenced their choices in any way, shape, or form. Clarence Thomas
I've been in the media all my life, and only now do I realize I haven't been using all this power.
It's influenced them at all is just ridiculous.
You don't take a trip on with billionaires who have business before the court. Look, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, she always
voted that way. That's the question.
Case. Judge Jackson recused herself from the Harvard case.
Guys, let each other speak.
Just because of her affiliation with the university. These people, Alito and Gorsuch, and Clarence Thomas, they've been out with billionaires, people who have had business before the court and didn't recuse themselves, like the basic fundamental things. And this idea that they don't know whether they're supposed to report these things, that's just actually not factual. And at the end of the day, I think we should all agree that they should hold themselves to the same standards that all other judges across the country have to do. You should be able to agree to that.
That's a couple of people on this Supreme Court. It's not a matter of principle. I'd like to address one thing. Ellie, you asked how affirmative action has failed. Here's how I think it's failed. And this runs against the grain of Joe Bob's notion of liberal media conspiring to affect public opinion. We have been allowed to believe that affirmative action places into colleges people who are otherwise disqualified or unqualified, as opposed to the reality, which is that it allows race to be one of many factors. Just as the famous 2019 study at Harvard showed that legacy and other legacy-related issues, which obviously favors white Americans, is a factor. No one actually thinks that a legacy is the only reason unqualified candidates got in, but it's allowed to be a factor. Now, who knows? If race is not allowed to be a factor, because in the real world there is a problem with race relations and the balance of power and of wealth between the races in America, then perhaps we should ban legacy admissions as well.
Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.